My name is Daniel Bromley, Manager of Design Policy, and I'll be presenting on a few of the bits of. So got other people here from the design and built environment team in the department who will help me in this presentation. We have about 120 to 130 people online. In terms of going forward, what we did see was a few questions come through when people signed up to view this presentation. Hopefully we've answered all those questions as we progress through the presentation. If you do have any questions or queries, please put them into the chat and we will get back to you with answers to those questions. Otherwise, we will be providing the Design WA email address, and if you have any questions or queries or need any further clarification on anything, we can get back to you via email and answer those questions for you, or give you a call if need be. So jumping into it, in terms of the background, the current R codes is the interim R codes from 2021. In February 2023, the R codes volume 1 was released and was due to be gazetted in September of last year. In August of 2023, the Minister deferred the gazettal of the medium density code, as it was called at that time, and that was to rework R30 and R40 standards to apply 2021 standards back into the R codes. The Commission, along with their consultant and the team here, worked on those amendments and have finalised those amendments. In February 2024, the Minister announced that the updated R codes, which we'll be talking about today, will be released in mid-March and gazetted in mid-April. So the R codes 2024 were released on Friday of last week, and the 2024 R codes will be gazetted on the 10th of April 2024. It should also be, just to let you know, that with the introduction of the new planning code regulations on March 1st, the R codes are no longer a state planning policy, but are now a planning code. What that means is that because the R codes are read into schemes and a subsidiary legislation, making them a code under the regs is a little bit more clearer in terms of their power. So what was released on Friday last week, these are all the documents that are now on the website. It should be noted that these are still not fully operational until the 10th of April. So the current 2021 R codes do apply until the 10th of April, when the new residential design codes volumes 1 and 2 will be gazetted, and the other documents here will help in applying those. So just a little bit of a code overview. We have the R codes volume 1 2024. It is broken up into four parts, with appendices. Part A is the operation of the code. Part B is how Part B will apply to single houses from R2 to R40, and that change is the change that was recently made in response to the Minister's request. Group dwellings, it applies to group dwellings in R2 to R25 codings, and multiple dwellings in R10 to R25. Part C, which was the medium density code and is now just Part C of Volume 1, will apply to single houses R50 and above, to group dwellings R30 and above, and to multiple dwellings R30 to R60. There is Part D land, and we'll talk about what's in that part later on in the presentation. We also have the R codes explanatory guidelines, which have been published. These are also very important and should be read alongside the R codes. We also have the R codes volume 2, which will now apply to multiple dwelling developments R80 and above, and the residential component of mixed use development. Matt will now present on the Part A operation of the code.
Just 2 slides and then I'm back off. So in terms of Part A, it's very much unchanged from what you know in the 2021 R code. So all the introduction stuff about dealing with applications, again to comply, design principles, and the exercise of discretion there, or exercise of judgment. So there are some changes. A main one of note is local planning frameworks. So additional requirements or additional provisions in Part C mean that there's some additional WPC oversight. I'll get into that. There is the inclusion of the SPP7 referenced, not previously referenced by the scope of the interim R codes. And then it also discusses the special transition arrangements in there with additionally a greater emphasis on the explanatory guidelines. I think there's some additional slides on the guidelines themselves, but the way they're structured is very useful in highlighting the intent. So whether you're having a discussion with a client about why one thing is required, an interpretation of DEM to comply, and then some guidance in terms of local planning framework considerations and also exercising discretion, the design principle pathway. For local planning frameworks, as discussed, so there are some changes. So you'll notice in there in section 3 of Part A, the requirements, the criteria to address when you're modifying the R codes through a local planning framework. There's those 2 additional criteria. So it's suggested the link with SPP7, and then additionally consistent with orderly and proper planning. So Part C, previously we said there was a reduced need for modifications. That's, I guess, not so much the case for R30 to 40, but for the R50 plus, that Part C development, particularly for terrace typologies, there's very much a reduced need for local development plans to kind of facilitate that product to a DEM to comply pathway, as an example. The more modifications that require WPC approval essentially are just related to additional elements. So those additional requirements in terms of the primary garden area, trees and landscaping, although not entirely new, and soil orientation. But you will be pleased to know that some of the previous ones that require WPC approval, so one of them was where you'd need access from a secondary street prior to primary. If you do need to modify that in Part B, that doesn't require WPC approval, and I think that's been an ongoing inquiry both externally and internally here at the department. In terms of local planning frameworks, the explanatory guidelines has a heightened link or discussion around pre-lodgement discussions with decision makers. So if you're proposing a local development plan, for instance, it's best to consider what requires, if there's any WPC approval requirements, and ultimately local government's decision maker on these. So have the discussions as early as you can with them to facilitate that approval pathway and then manage those community expectations through the advertising process. And to assist with that and addressing that criteria, we do have assessment templates. They're on the website. So you'll see them there under the documents, and therefore considering modifications to the R codes via local planning policies and local development plans.
Thanks, Matt. Just a little bit on the explanatory guidelines. So we think this document is just as important as the R codes themselves. It really does help when you're going down that the performance pathway. So it's there to assist in R code interpretation and application. Part C of the explanatory guidelines is broken up into the intent, so outlines what the intent of that particular element is. There's some design guidance there to guide how you may interpret that particular provision and apply it. There's then assessment guidance also for local governments to help them assess things that may go down a more performance pathway. There's some design tips, again, to help everyone understand how they might address those provisions and create a great design. And then there's some guidance in there around local planning frameworks and what needs to be considered when a local government may be seeking to modify any provisions through a local planning frameworks. Should be known that there were just some consequential changes to the explanatory guidelines from the previous explanatory guidelines that were published prior to September of last year. In terms of Part B, so there's not much change to Part B from the 2021 R codes. We have the R30/40 single houses now retained in Part B, and that was the major change which came out of the Minister's request. The site area concessions now apply for small and accessible dwellings, and that will continue. And then there has been some modifications to ancillary dwellings, which has been quite in the press, which is around permitted. They're now permitted on group dwelling sites. The minimum site area of 350 square metres, which was required for an ancillary dwellings, has been removed. And one of the deemed to comply in the ancillary dwelling section of Part B has been removed. It was a deemed to comply, which was a little bit ambiguous in that it talked about colour, roof pitch and materials having to be of the ancillary dwelling, having to be compatible with the existing single dwelling or group dwelling on site. That has been removed. However, there is guidance in the explanatory guidelines on how people may design or construct an ancillary dwelling that is suitable for the site. And then we have Part C, which was the old medium density code, but is now just Part C of the R codes Volume 1. Similar to previous, it is broken up into 3 parts. There is the garden, where it talks about and addresses trees, private open space and water management. There is Part 2, the building, which addresses indoor amenity, the function of the dwelling, and seeks to improve housing diversity. And then there is neighbourliness, which talks about the built form and character of the house, how it fits into the neighbourhood context, and how the dwelling may relate to the community as well. Just going to pass you over to Jenna, who will talk about the the garden and the primary garden area.
Thanks, Dan. So Chapter 1, the garden, contains element 1.1, private open space, and this element remains unchanged following the Minister's request for amendments. And so the aim of this element is to provide functional and usable outdoor areas. It's also to provide consolidated spaces that focus on the primary garden area. It's to provide more spaces for gardens and trees with areas large enough to accommodate the use for the occupant, as well as trees and soft landscaping. The space should be mostly uncovered to provide for daylighting and natural ventilation into that dwelling. There are minimum requirements for the primary garden area size. They're based on site area rather than density coding, so that's a change from the 2021 R codes. There's a minimum 3 metre dimension to provide flexibility for a range of typologies, including group dwellings, and a requirement for 2/3 of the site to be uncovered. So where lots are smaller and more constrained, there is a requirement that the primary garden area is completely uncovered to allow for adequate daylighting and natural ventilation into these homes. So the Commission would be seeking to avoid any modifications to these clauses through local planning frameworks, as we believe it's a critical element to the objectives and outcomes of the R codes. The element 1.2, trees and landscaping, includes provisions which seek to improve the tree canopy on private lots and improve the health and growth of trees through appropriately sized deep soil areas and tree protections. They also seek to provide more permeable surfaces with more landscaping, less hardscaping than previously seen. There are requirements for at least 1 small tree per dwelling, with a minimum of a 9 square metres deep soil area required for that tree. Trees are also required in the primary street setback. In terms of compliance, it's up to the local government, up to the local government to enforce it. And various local governments are already prioritising urban greening and are supportive of planting on private land. There's a new defined term for soft landscaping that requires a minimum 300 mil soil depth, and 15% of the site is to be provided as soft landscaping with a minimum dimension of 1 metre. There is a requirement for 30% of the front setback to contain soft landscaping. This is a reduction from the 2021 version, which allowed 50% in the front setback, and that's to allow for narrow lot frontages on tighter site arrangements. And these settings remain unchanged in the 2024 version. The element 2.1, size and layout of dwellings, contains the most changes to Part C provisions following the Minister's request. So a primary living space is still required per dwelling, along with access to the primary garden area or a private open space. However, the minimum dimensions for the primary living space and bedroom areas and minimum dimensions have been removed for single houses and group dwellings and are now applicable to multiple dwellings only. This element seeks to improve occupant amenity and the functional use of the living area with a direct relationship to the garden. And the 2024 changes ensure that apartments are adequately sized internally and can be properly furnished. So element 2.2, solar access and natural ventilation, remains relatively unchanged. So there are still requirements for open wall windows to habitable rooms and the solar access requirement to the primary living space. This requires a major opening for the primary living space to be oriented between east and northwest, with an adjoining uncovered area of 3.3 by 3 metres to allow solar access to enter that primary living space. So while the area requirement for a courtyard is still applicable to all building types, the minimum dimension has been amended and now applies to multiple dwellings only. The intent of these provisions is to enhance occupant amenity internal to the dwelling and to optimise winter solar gain and minimise summer sunlight into the primary living space in climate zones 4, 5 and 6, and reduce household running costs through better thermal performance. The element 2.3 parking requirements are linked to the number of bedrooms and locational criteria. There are maximums for garages and carport parking, but no restrictions on other types of uncovered parking. For example, there is a 2-car maximum for 2+ bedrooms in location A. There are also minimum requirements. So there is a 1-car bay requirement for 3+ bedroom dwellings in location A and B, and no car bays are required for dwellings with 2 bedrooms or less in location A. So this allows greater flexibility for alternative parking arrangements depending on the market. The aim is to reduce the extent of covered parking on site to allow more space for people rather than parking. The element 2.7 universal design remains unchanged in Part C. So for accessible dwellings, there are no minimum requirements or occupancy restrictions. So they've been removed as a modification from the 2021 version, where a gold level accessible dwelling is proposed and it meets the requirements of the element. A 35% site area concession is applicable. So for 10+ grouped or multiple dwellings, there is a 20% requirement for a silver level universal design, and that's been included in this version. And there's checklists in the appendices that aim to simplify assessment when assessing a universal design or accessible dwelling. The intent of this element is to encourage greater housing diversity and support ageing in place. Element 2.9, small dwellings, aims to provide greater housing choice and affordable infill options. So there's no limit on the number of bedrooms permissible in a small dwelling. However, the 70 square metre internal floor area applies to single and group dwellings, and there's 60 square metre for multiple dwellings. The internal floor area definition that differs from the plot ratio area that was previous in the 2021 version, in that the internal walls are excluded from the calculation, so that a slightly larger dwelling may be possible. The small dwellings that meet the requirements of this element are permitted a 35% site area concession. And as part of the 2024 amendments, this element, as well as the universal design element and associated site area incentives, have been included in Part B and apply to 30 to 40 single houses. Element 2.8, ancillary dwellings, that applies to all dwelling types, so single houses, group dwellings and multiple dwellings. There's no minimum lot area requirement in Part C, but an internal floor area of 70 square metres applies. And the intent of this element is to broaden the application of ancillary dwellings to provide greater housing diversity, affordable housing options and ageing in place. And there have been no changes to this element from the 2023 draft. And I'll hand over to Katie now to run through the neighbourliness chapter. Thanks, Katie.
Hello, section 3 is neighbourliness, and element 3.1 of neighbourliness is the site cover change, which, as part of the transitional arrangements, the change from open space to site cover is going to be deferred for 24 months until the 10th of April 2026. The current open space calculations include common property and portions of covered outdoor living areas, verandas, and that will continue to apply until April 2026. After transition, site cover will replace open space as the measure for the extent of building that covers a site. The calculation's been simplified and percentages increased to balance the change. During testing, it was found that the size of primary garden area influenced the amount of site cover, so we don't expect a significant change in outcomes. The 24 months aligns with the transition period to allow for developers to adjust to the new definition. Building height, element 3.2. The building height requirement has been adjusted to be measured in stories as well as metres to allow increased heights in higher coded areas. For our 30 to 40 group dwellings, the height in metres remains much the same, but has the addition of being required to be 2 stories. For our 50 and above, a 3rd story and an additional 3 metres is allowed. And for R80, a 4th story and a further additional 3 metres is allowed. The addition of stories provides flexibility for proponents for more generous floor-to-ceiling heights and improved internal amenity, while the height in metres maintains certainty for the community and assessors. Building height is still based on maximum wall and total building heights relative to roof types, and modifications for specific contexts where additional height may be desired can still be sought through local planning frameworks. Element 3.4, lot boundary setbacks. The lot boundary setback table has been significantly simplified. Up to 3.5 metres high, a simple, straightforward 1 metre setback. Up to 7 metres high, a 1.5 metre setback, and above 7 metres, a 3 metre setback. Second story walls setback less than 3 metres are limited to 14 metres in length, and in R50 and above, 2-story boundary walls up to 14 metres in length are permitted, subject to overshadowing requirements, and they are no longer restricted to only be allowed on 2 boundaries. 3.6 streetscape. The garage width calculations remain the same as in the 2021 code at 50% for single-storey development and 60% for 2-storey or greater where the upper floor extends over more than half the garage. The figures for Part C clarify that a porch or veranda, pier or post in front of a garage is considered to hide that portion of the garage and reduce the garage width as viewed from the street. The visual privacy element, 3.1, provisions are much more context specific and provide for more diverse and innovative solutions. The cone of vision may be allowed to extend beyond the lot boundary where it can be shown that there is no actual conflict. Where a development adjoins a vacant site, however, as the potential conflict is unknown, the cone of vision must remain within the lot boundaries. It's intended to reduce the use of highlight windows and increase internal amenity and internal and external visual appeal of the solutions for visual privacy. And then Part D is the land, outlines the site area controls which relate to both low and medium density codes. New provisions within the land Part D relate to the medium density or 30 to 40 groups and 50 plus single dwelling coded areas only. The site area concessions is the most significant change with accessible and small dwellings, which have already been discussed by Jenna in the building typologies. So what I've got here as my notes is very much about that. But the concession for the accessible and small dwelling types has increased from 1/3 to 35%. It's capped at a minimum site area of 100 square metres though. The universal accessible dwellings have been increased internal floor area up to 110 square metres as opposed to the 100 square metre internal floor area limitation for aged independent persons dwellings. Small dwellings, as Jen has already mentioned, have the same 70 square metre internal floor area limitation as single bedroom dwellings, but without the bedroom limitation, there is much greater flexibility. Small dwellings are limited to 50% within any one development to maintain diversity, while accessible dwellings in 50 plus coded areas can access concession for up to 100% of the dwelling.
Thanks, Katie. We're just going to pass over to Matt, who's going to talk about the planning bulletins and other key changes around the transitional arrangement.
Thank you. So one thing that you'll notice from the Minister's changes here is that in 2023, Planning Bulletin 112 RMD was being rescinded. So that has, in a sense, been rebirthed with R30 to 40 single house development remaining in Part B. But you will notice there that with R60, so the RMD 60 being dealt with under Part C, that is now subject to being removed and subject to transitional arrangements. So what that means is that an RMD local planning policy, for example, will it'll still apply in full up to R40, but the RMD 60 at the end of the special transition period will Part C will prevail over that. So it's likely that local governments may amend these to remove it at the end of the special transition period. But knowing kind of the frame of it anyway, that there's a lot of these provisions kind of baked into local development plans, so there's a few different moving parts there. In terms of anything else to say on that, yeah, next slide. So R&D is here to stay for a little bit longer. Planning Bulletin 114 2024. So this is very much the same as what was previously released last year. It's just that you're referencing dates, times are a little bit different. So this was the planning bulletin that discussed what applies when during the deferred gazettal. So previously 6 month deferred gazettal, now a 1 month deferred gazettal, and then the 24-month special transition period, which will apply again. It's just from gazettal date, it's a different date. So it runs you through determination of applications, whether it's just building permits, development applications during this deferred gazettal period. What happens to existing local planning frameworks, which I've got some slides additionally that are hopefully a little bit more helpful and easy to digest on that. And then current proposed local planning frameworks. So if you're working on any local development plans currently, the expectation would be that it'd be modifying Part C if relevant. Otherwise, just taking note of any consequential mods to Part B from the 2021 policy. There is also some discussion there about dealing with one of the kind of greater changes, I suppose, is multiple dwelling development being dealt with under Volume 2. So for that R40 to R60 range, that would now be captured in Part C. So if there's any of those developments, just be aware. So for the special transition provisions, again, they're the same. There's some changes with terms of how they're framed, in a sense, and that they apply differently. So Part C obviously is R50 plus. The transitional provisions are applicable to single house development that is subject to a existing structure plan and or local development plan. The intent really is to maintain that development exempt pathway, single houses being exempt from development approval. So it's kind of to maintain that exempt pathway. There is, and well, in explaining that, I suppose that what the transitional provisions do, and this was has been very largely communicated previously, is that any new provisions in Part C, so for example, increase requirements for tree planting and landscaping or the solar orientation, they're either modified to better align with the current provisions, so the 2021 provisions, or they're scratched out and removed, not required to be met during that special transition period. So that'll still apply. There is that inclusion of the open space special transition provision that Katie spoke about. So that's just, you know, deferring site cover controls until the end of the special transition period, and that's for the whole Part C essentially. It's not exclusive to local planning instruments. Yeah. So this is a timeline that can just kind of help a little bit in terms of reading the planning bulletin. This is the same timeline that we had. We've obviously just tweaked it with different times and dates. And so in this deferred gazette period, obviously just being mindful that if you've got a DA that you're preparing now, your expectation won't be that you're going to comply with the 2021 codes. Local governments will be saying that they're assessing these proposals on the basis of the framework applicable the day the decision's made. So statutory timeframe, 60 days, 90 days, depending on advertising. If you're lodging a DA now, you can't anticipate that it would be approved under the 2021 code. It would be approved under Part C, where applicable, obviously, it's for R30, 40, like R30 plus for a dwelling, or an R50 plus single house. In the special transition period, I guess on that note, that's kind of dually so for building permits. If you are trying to rush through some building permits, just know that there's obviously a bit of a risk there if there's any hold up. So that's kind of at your own risk. Local governments will be reviewing policies throughout the special transition period with a view of alignment. And then, of course, we've said about the R&D policy, they'll be aligning that to have effect at the end of the special transition period. If they don't do so, Part C prevails for R&D 60 anyway, unless otherwise dealt with in an LDP. So that should be fine. So for local planning policies are a little bit different in that they don't have an expiration date. So they're kind of at the mercy of the policy change. If the framework changes, then so do they. Or then it prevails over the local planning policy. So if a local planning policy modifies the R codes parts, like for example, an R50 single house, you're assessing it against Part C now. There is a transitional, like the transition period applies for local planning policies to continue to have effect of amending Part C as they otherwise previously did for the 2021 codes. So they'll still apply throughout the 2 years, gives the local government time to amend those local planning policies. So just be mindful in any development applications you're proposing. It's not just Part C. Be mindful of those existing local planning policies as they'll continue to modify Part C. I think that's everything on local planning. Yeah, go on to just making sure I'm not missing anything. So, and then local development plans, they're obviously a bit different. They've got an expiration date under the regs, so they're not impacted by the change in the policy. Essentially, they live on until expiry. They'll continue to modify the R codes Part C as they otherwise did until expiry. There's an expectation that local government might amend these, and this might just be to change the wording and the provision reference just to improve their assessment of it. If the legibility isn't great, for example, if it references like an old provision that is now been reworded to something different, outdoor living area, the primary garden area is fairly straightforward, but there are some other examples where they might do that just to improve their own processes. Just be aware of that. And I think that's everything on local development plans.
Thanks, Matt. That basically concludes our presentation for this morning. So we've run through, I guess, the key changes in Part C. We've run through the key changes that came out of the Minister's request at the end of last year. And we've also run through how this impacts the local planning frameworks. As I said at the beginning, we did receive a few questions through the JOP form where people signed up. Hopefully we've answered those as part of the presentation. There's also a chat online there where we will look to answer any questions in the chat. But we are here and we're available to provide advice on the R codes, local planning frameworks, or anything regarding the transitional arrangements. So if you do have any questions or need to seek clarification, please email us at designwa@dplh.wa.gov.au, or you can give us a call, or we can call you back to chat about anything. Just remember that there are the important resources online. There's the Planning Bulletin 114, which details the transitional arrangements. The website has a whole bunch of information on there, including any background information related to the medium density code at that time. And we encourage you to use the explanatory guidelines. They are very important and are often forgotten, but we think they should be used alongside the code. Hopefully that was good for everyone. we will attempt to answer any questions you have, and we're always here to provide assistance as we go forward. So the Gazette will be on the 10th of April, and thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a good day.